Hey folks, this is Abel James, and thanks so much for joining us on Fat Burning Man, where we talk about real food and real results. This week's guest is a fellow podcaster, mythbuster, and warrior of wellness, our friend Mr. Chris Kresser. Chris, of course, is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Paleo Cure, and he's host of Revolution Health Radio. For a man so freakishly knowledgeable about health, Chris's non-dogmatic, balanced approach to wellness is refreshing. Here's a case in point. Last time I saw Chris in person here in Austin, Texas, we were both chowing on grass-fed ice cream, and it was delicious. So if you ever wonder to yourself, can I be paleo and still have ice cream or cheese or something like that every once in a while? Or can I be vegan and eat meat sometimes? It doesn't have to be complicated. We're here to be balanced, and today we're going to sort it out with the one and only Chris Kresser. On this special throwback episode of the show, we'll explore the top 5 myths in fat loss, health, and longevity, and also discuss why science tells us a different story than the media. But first, there are just too many treats lurking this time of year. Instead of giving up your favorite holiday treats like the cookies, the pies, and the cheesecake for the sake of health, how about you make them guilt-free at home with real food ingredients? If you want squeaky clean, low-sugar, fat-burning recipes all in one place, I've got good news. We slashed the price on our best-selling e-cookbook and fat loss program, The Fat Burning Chef. Check it out today to get over 200 delicious fat-burning, muscle-feeding recipes from the best cooks in paleo and beyond. You can get all the goodies by typing in this URL, fatburningschef.com. From any device, just type in fatburningschef.com. Heather says, as a busy mom of 2 kids, just starting her paleo journey, I can use all the help I can get. Quick and easy? Yes, please. Vicky says, the bacon wrapped meatballs were delicious baked on a bed of cabbage. The whole family loved them. I'm happy to hear that, Vicky. Elizabeth says, my 4-year-old and I had fun making the zucchini meat boats and the sweet potato medallions. Very good. But this isn't just about the recipes. We want to change the world with real food. So when you buy the Fat Burning Chef program, you get a free copy to give as a gift to share with family or friends. Help us spread this message of health and share it with the people you care about completely for free. Since it's a digital program, that makes it super easy, and you can do it from your phone, tablet, computer, and anything in between. All you have to do to get your discount and bonuses is go to fatburningschef.com. All right, on to the show with Mr. Chris Kresser. We'll explore the top 5 myths in fat loss, why science often tells us a different story than the media, and why cavemen really died young. Let's go hang out with Chris. All right, folks, we're here with Chris Kresser, a practitioner of integrative and functional medicine, author of the just-released Your Personal Paleo Code, and our favorite mythbuster and health detective. What's cooking, Chris?
A lot, as you might imagine. I'm happy to be here, Abel. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for coming. A lot of people ask for you, Chris, and I'm really glad that you had the chance to come on the show. Why don't we start with, I love one of the things that you do so well, and I just mentioned this, and the way that I found you originally was you just like take all of these things that most people understand to be true, and you just stomp on them until they're dead. So how did you get started doing that?
Well, as is the case with many people, my interest in health came out of my own experience.
Mm-hmm.
In my early 20s, shortly after I graduated from UC Berkeley, I decided to take off and see the world. And I sold most of my possessions and started traveling. I began in Thailand and other Southeast Asia.
Cool.
And ended up in Indonesia to do some surfing. I've been a lifelong surfer, and Indonesia is kind of a mecca for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was living on a little island called Sumbawa and surfing in a village there. And, you know, I got the typical tropical illness, delirious, vomiting, diarrhea, fever. Didn't really know what was going on for 3 or 4 days. And I had some antibiotics in my medical kit that an Australian who was in the village managed to administer to me while I was there. And that kind of brought me back from the brink, but it then evolved into this basically decade-long chronic, mysterious illness that really just took me to the curb, essentially.
Yeah.
And you know, there were years where I couldn't even work. I was so sick. I tried everything you could possibly imagine, from the conventional treatments
Mm-hmm.
to the most bizarre, esoteric, you know, left field shamanistic energy medicine treatments. I moved to a retreat center in Big Sur for 2 years at one point to explore the psycho-spiritual, emotional aspects of the illness. I mean, no stone was left unturned. And during that process, it became clear to me that there was nobody that was more invested in my health and well-being than me, right? Most of the doctors I saw were very well-meaning, and they were good people, and they wanted to help, but they just didn't have either the tools or the time, or they were also victims of the same system that we're victims of as patients of the conventional medical care system. So at one point I was in Boulder, and I saw an acupuncturist and a practitioner of Chinese medicine, and that was the first time I'd actually seen some real results. And that inspired me to go back to school and start studying on my own. And in that process, I took classes in research methodology and began to read the literature myself and learn how to critique it and understand what it actually says versus what the media and people reporting on the research say it says, which are often two different things, as you know. And so then it just evolved from there. I really started to get kind of obsessed with reading the literature on certain topics. And to be honest, Abel, I didn't start out with a kind of conspiracy theorist bent, and I still don't have one. I don't think there are big conspiracies to delude the public for the most part. I mean, certainly there are conflicts of interest with pharmaceutical industry that play a role, but I think it's mostly just a case of science evolving and changing, our understanding evolving and changing over time, and then this notion of groupthink, which is just that when a lot of people believe something, it's pretty hard to go against the grain, especially if you work in a field where your funding comes from, organizations that are invested in that particular hypothesis.
Right.
There's a great saying I love from a philosopher named Anatole France that says, it goes, even if 50 million people say a thing, it's still a foolish thing.
Yeah.
So that's what I try to keep in mind when I'm reading the literature, and when we come across these ideas that are not even questioned because they're so deeply ingrained in our cultural consciousness, I try to keep that in mind.
Yeah. Can we do this? Because there are so many, obviously, and we've covered a lot of them in past episodes, and I know you have as well. But if someone is just listening to this for the first time, just dipping their toes into this crazy wild world that we live in, can you do, say, like the top 5, just like sound bites of what is the myth? What is the truth? And then we can move on to the next one. And if their eyebrows are raised, they can find the answer in your book or on our podcast or whatever.
Right. Well, I'd have to say that saturated fat and cholesterol are right up there. So the diet hard hypothesis holds that eating saturated fat and cholesterol raise cholesterol levels in the blood. And then the second part of it is that high cholesterol levels in the blood cause heart disease. Now, I'm somewhere in the middle on this, actually, compared to other low-carb paleo advocates. I think it's more complex than it's made out to be. You have two extremes. Like on one end, you have the cholesterol believers who say that cholesterol, they say essentially what I just said, and that you should avoid saturated fat and cholesterol at all costs and avoid having high cholesterol levels at all costs. Now, on the other end, you have the cholesterol deniers, or skeptics, we might call them, who say cholesterol has nothing to do with heart disease. And the truth is a little bit more complex. And if you want, we can talk more about it. But the truth, according to the scientific literature that we have, is that on average, eating saturated fat does not raise cholesterol levels. It does in some people, but on average, meaning overall, it doesn't. And eating dietary cholesterol doesn't raise cholesterol levels in the blood. And then the second part, high cholesterol levels in the blood do have some association with heart disease, but it's certainly not the only risk factor and may not even be the primary risk factor. So that's number 1, I would say.
One of my favorites.
Yeah. Number 2, and of course, number 2 is related to number 1, but it's separate too. So that's the idea that red meat is bad for you. And I would say that's generally broken into 3 parts. The idea that red meat raises cholesterol in blood, so that's how it's related to number 1. red meat contributes to increases the risk of colorectal cancer, colon cancer. That would be the number 2 reason. And then the idea that red meat contributes to inflammation. And it turns out that none of those are true according to the research that we have. And again, we can go into more detail later if you want. So that's 2. Number 3 would be probably the connection between sodium and salt and high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease. It is true that sodium raises blood pressure in some people, a small minority of people who are what are called sodium sensitive or salt sensitive. So they're particularly sensitive to the effects of sodium. Mm-hmm. But in the majority of people, it doesn't, there's not a strong relationship. And in fact, salt, like many other nutrients, plays some important roles and is actually important to health. And so too little sodium can cause problems, just as too much sodium can cause problems. Yeah. And ironically, too little sodium can actually contribute to heart disease. So that's a little known fact,
as it turns out.
Yeah. So let's see. Number 4 might be. Let's see. So probably this one's good because it's both a mainstream myth and a maybe alternative myth. Mm-hmm. In the alternative health circles, the idea that we shouldn't eat fish because of concerns about mercury, mm-hmm. and then more recently concerns about radiation from Fukushima. In both cases, the risk is minimal, and the benefits of especially cold water, fatty fish consumption are so dramatic, and profound that the risk of not eating fish is far, far greater than the risk of eating fish. Mm-hmm. And again, we can go into mechanisms there too. So, gosh, there's so many.
I know, it's hard.
Well, let's pick a fun one. The idea that frequently when you see critiques of the paleo diet or the paleo concept, you'll hear something along the lines of, well, okay, why do we even care about our Paleolithic ancestors, and why would we want to emulate their health and their diet and lifestyle, because they all died when they were 30?
Yeah.
Right? So what's the point? It is true that the average lifespan of our ancestors was short, but that's because they faced challenges that we don't have to face today, like very high rates of infant mortality.
Saber-toothed tigers.
Yeah, exactly. Lions, trauma, accidents, violence amongst tribes, living outdoors, exposure to the elements. And so if you took, like, say, 10 hypothetical hunter-gatherer ancestors, and 4 of them die in early childhood, another 3 of them die due to warfare in their teenage years, and the other 3 live until they're 80, the average lifespan of that group is going to be very low, mm-hmm. right? But it's got nothing to do with their diet and lifestyle. It has everything to do with their access to emergency medical care and infant mortality and trauma, violence, et cetera. So some interesting studies were done by these anthropologists, Guervin and Kaplan, who went down to South America and studied some of the last remaining contemporary hunter-gatherers who'd had very little contact with Western culture. And they found that these groups, which did actually have access to rudimentary emergency medical care, mm-hmm. had lifespans that were on average about the same as ours. But wow. they reached those ages without any of the chronic inflammatory diseases mm-hmm. that characterize our old age, like diabetes, heart disease, arthritis, most cancers, etc.
Yeah. And that's such an interesting one, because it's so common. That's what a lot of people say when they hear the caveman diet, and it's all about cartoons and hitting people over the head with clubs and that sort of thing. And it's a joke. I mean, we do that to ourselves too. Like, I do that all the time, and it is kind of a joke. But when you look at the actual argument that a lot of especially the articles at the beginning of this whole paleo thing came out with, there's still, those myths are still talked about, or saying that, cavemen always died young.
Yeah,
it's just it's a bizarre approach, because most people, if you ask the same people, or if you ask most doctors, they're just like, well, diet doesn't really matter that much. So the reason they died young was all these lifestyle factors. But if you look at the diet one specifically, and then you look at all the things that we're dying from now and tie that back to the diet, it's so glaringly obvious that anyone who takes like a quick second and actually looks at what they're looking at, right? It just seems very obvious.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate in my mind that paleo, I guess it was unavoidable from the start because it was so ripe for caricature.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the whole Fred Flintstone concept and the guy running around with the big club beating people over the head. And I wonder if there's a way that that could have been avoided. Probably not. But the unfortunate thing about that is that I think a lot of people have developed a knee-jerk reaction to the concept of paleo. And so when some people hear it, there's like an immediate shutdown and a lack of openness to even considering what is very legitimate science that supports the concept of mismatch.
Mm-hmm.
I frequently hear, for example, I was just browsing through the Reddit subreddit for paleo. Now, I'm completely new to Reddit. It was my first time ever using it. Apparently, I've been living in a cave myself. It's, you know, someone described it as the front page of the internet. And I was like, I haven't seen the front page of the internet. I better go check this out. And there's 60,000 members in the paleo subreddit. And there was a thread on there started by someone about something to the effect of what parts of the paleo diet do you not agree with or do you think are bunk, you know? And so I was scrolling through there. It was very educational for me to see what people are saying about it. And of course, the main points that were raised were things like this or other red herrings like paleo is necessarily low carb, or there was a single paleo diet, which of course we know wasn't true. There, you know, there's a very wide variation in what paleo people ate, but what was really clear was that there are a lot of people who had this strong association with paleo one way or the other, and there wasn't a really kind of open-minded. Well, actually, the quality of the discussion was pretty high compared to some forums I've seen.
Totally. Yeah.
But, you know, there were a couple comments on there. This is what I was saying, where there's no evidence to support the paleo diet. And this is a really limited view because certainly if you look for studies that explicitly are testing the paleo diet in a clinical trial, there are only about, I think, 3 or 4 of those now. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of studies that indirectly support the paleo concept. You know, anthropological studies looking at the diet of our ancestors in contemporary hunter-gatherer societies that show that they were virtually free of all of the modern diseases that kill millions of us every year. I mean, that alone is a very compelling body of evidence to examine, because if these people, there's this idea in our culture that all of these diseases are somehow inevitable. You know, it's like just a normal part of aging. You go to a doctor and you tell them you're getting tired or your blood pressure is going up or all of these things, they're not going to think that that's unusual or abnormal. They just think that that's a normal part of aging. But we know by looking at these other populations that that's not a normal part of aging, and that these diseases are not, in fact, inevitable, and that they are pretty new on the scene. Like we're talking about really only a few hundred years where these diseases have become commonplace, and really in the last 110 years for things like heart disease, and the last 50 years for things like type 2 diabetes, where they've become as common as they are. So we all think they're normal, but there's a big difference between common and normal, right? And that's what studying these populations can tell us. And then we have a lot of research supporting this mismatch hypothesis that is often discussed in the conferences I speak at and go to, like the Ancestral Health Symposium, where it's well known in the evolutionary biology world that all organisms are adapted to survive and thrive in a particular environment. And when you change the environment faster than the organism can adapt, mismatch occurs. And that's not really a controversial concept. It's pretty well accepted, and humans are, like it or not, we're animals, so we're subject to the same constraints. So then there's all kinds of studies that look at the nutrient density of foods and have shown that meat and organ meat and fish and vegetables and fruits and nuts and seeds are in general far more nutrient dense than grains and legumes, especially when you consider the anti-nutrients like phytic acid that inhibit the absorption of some of the minerals that those foods contain.
Yeah.
Now, in my opinion, as I say in the book, that doesn't mean we absolutely shouldn't eat grains and legumes, especially if they've been properly prepared, but it does mean that they shouldn't form the foundation of our diet, and it does mean that they're inferior in terms of nutrient density to the quote paleo food. So, I mean, I could keep going down the list. There's tons of evidence to support the paleo diet or the paleo template or whatever you want to call it. Even though there aren't specific studies looking at one particular diet.
And what science is there to support 100 calorie packs?
Yeah.
That's how I usually answer it. I mean, like the things that we accept to be, like you said, common versus normal. It's an interesting debate because what we accept as normal are all these things that we assume that they're supported by science or something. And like the media says that they might be, but like the fundamental framework of calories in, calories out, and the idea that a 100 calorie pack of whatever would work for anything is a little bit preposterous when you take a step back, because you can say that there isn't science for anything, and you can say that there is science for almost anything. And that's an interesting thing. I think you have a very balanced approach to that, and it's one that's fantastic for this community because it's really easy to be polarized on either side.
Yeah, it is. And you know, I think humans are drawn to drama for some reason. I haven't totally figured out the evolutionary basis for that. But it's, I'm glad that there are, you know, when I first started writing and I wondered whether anyone would listen at all, because I do kind of take a middle of the road stance, not on principle or because I think that the middle of the road kind of moderate approach is the best, but because when I look at all the evidence, that's where I almost always come out. And that's oftentimes not as interesting as the polls, one side or the other. But I do agree with you. I think that generally when you look at the evidence, it's a lot more complex and nuanced than either side of the extreme makes it out to be. And I will admit that when I first started doing this, I was a little bit more, I tended to be perhaps a little bit more aligned with the side of the debate that was against the mainstream. And perhaps a lot of people will think that's still true, but I would say now I have a much deeper appreciation and respect for mainstream researchers and scientists, and I don't think they got it all wrong. I think that there's a lot that they get right, but there's also some things that have escaped their attention for various reasons, whether those reasons are due to conflicts of interest or whether they're just due to groupthink or whether they're due to some other reason. It's just, I think it's a lot more nuanced and complex, but I don't think we should, throw out all mainstream research because we don't like it.
What would you say to the people who go kind of back and forth on that and ride whatever is said from both of those sides? So an example would be someone goes on CNN.com and reads an article saying, oh, I should never eat butter. Butter's bad for me. And then the next week, they hear about putting butter in their coffee and they're drinking like a whole stick of butter and kind of going back and forth in between all these different things.
Yeah.
What do you recommend for someone like that who does get caught up in those details and then starts living them, because that's not obviously the best way to live?
Yeah, well, I can empathize with that. It's really hard, I think, now to be a consumer or a person. I hate using the term consumer, but it's the comment, to be a person in this world that is trying to figure this stuff out, because especially if you don't have the training and the background or the time or interest to read the original literature yourself. I mean, someone might come to my website and read an article that seems pretty compelling and well-researched, and they, saying that saturated fat isn't the evil nutrient they've been told. And then they might find themselves reading an article on CNN or, some other in Scientific American or something saying that red meat causes heart disease by a new mechanism that's been recently
Right.
discovered. It's the contribution to TMAO levels. And, it's just kind of overwhelming. And the average person is just, I think they're really confused, understandably, and don't really know what to make of all this stuff. And so for me, I tend to evaluate health claims, or fairly early on, I developed, at least in my head, a kind of framework for evaluating health claims. And I think of it as a triangle. And one point on the triangle is anthropological evidence or evolutionary biology and traditional wisdom, we could say. Another point on that would be modern clinical and observational research. So randomized clinical trials and then observational epidemiological research. And then another point on that triangle would be my personal experience and my clinical experience working with patients. So when I evaluate a claim, I try to run it through all of those three lenses. And if it passes all three, I feel a lot more certain about it.
Yeah.
I'm almost never entirely certain, but I feel a lot more certain about it. And then I feel comfortable making recommendations based on it. If it passes one or two, but doesn't pass another, then I'm a little less sure about it. So let's use an example, perhaps. So if we say red meat is harmful because it causes cancer and heart disease and increases chronic inflammation, and we have some modern observational and epidemiological studies that support that, then I'm going to go over to that other point on the triangle with the anthropological evidence and look at cultures that traditional cultures that ate a lot of red meat and see if there's a high occurrence of those diseases in those cultures. And sure enough, if you look at people like the Maasai in Africa who ate primarily the milk, the meat, and the blood of the cattle that they raised, they're pastoralist people, you see virtually non-existent rates of all of those inflammatory diseases. So either red meat is not solely to blame, or doesn't significantly contribute to those conditions, or they have some other magical thing going on there that negates those effects. So that's just one example of how this kind of framework can be employed, and I think particularly the evolutionary or traditional health lens is the most important when there's any kind of conflict between in the modern research. So if you have some studies saying this and some studies saying that, that's when I look back to the ancestral template and see what there is to be found there, and that can generally resolve the debate.
Yeah, I think that framework is so brilliant, and I haven't really heard it described that way. But I think if people take a step back and try to not just listen to what other people are saying, but combine that in some way with their own experience, the anecdotal, even though it's not scientific by any means, and especially in most cases, the way that most people do it,
right.
That doesn't mean that it's not useful and that it doesn't give you an idea of how to change your life and live your life in a better way, especially if you're getting all these hypotheses, if you can call them that, from all these different places that are really all over the place. So let me ask you this. You've been doing this for a long time. Your work is highly respected. I encourage a lot of people to check it out. You do great stuff. How often, using this framework, do you actually change your mind at this point?
Not often, but there have been some notable occurrences where I have changed my mind, and I really make an effort to do that when the research, when I come across new research that informs my opinion in a different way. So there are a couple of examples that come to mind right off the bat. One is fructose. So when I first started doing this, I was influenced by some other thinkers in the field who claim that fructose is uniquely toxic to the human body and is uniquely problematic, and we should really try to minimize our intake of fructose as much as possible. Even I never really suggested limiting fruit intake that much, but the idea was that even fructose in fruit, if you eat a lot of fruit, could be harmful. I don't think that that's true anymore for most people. I think that both glucose and fructose can be harmful when eaten in excess. Fructose, there's been some really interesting studies that David Despain has reported on in his blog that show that fructose is mostly converted into inert, harmless substances, and it doesn't have a toxic effect on the liver when it's eaten in normal, moderate, eaten in whole food form. There is some evidence definitely that suggests that fructose has some uniquely harmful metabolic effects when it's eaten in really large amounts, which you can pretty much only get by eating, drinking soda and fructose sweetened beverages and things like agave syrup, which are like 90% fructose, the healthy sweetener, right?
Yeah, right.
So I think that fructose eaten in moderation and even in fairly significant amounts of fruit each day, that there's no evidence that that's harmful for human beings.
Well, harmful at least in the sense that it's toxic, right?
Right.
So
yeah.
What that means doesn't necessarily, you're not saying that you can, because some people will hear that and they'll be like, oh, I don't have to worry about fructose anymore. And so, they'll go and make
Well, let me put it this way. There are studies, it all boils down to individual tolerance. So everything that I say has to be taken through that lens, because if I say fructose isn't harmful, then you might go read an article that I wrote about how fructose is a FODMAP, and people with digestive issues like IBS have fructose intolerance. In fact, a fairly high percentage of people, and IBS is really common. So that's certainly a situation where excess fructose can be a problem, and not fructose necessarily itself, because if there's an equal amount of fructose and glucose in a food, fructose is transported out of the intestine, bound to glucose or with glucose, the same enzymes that do that for glucose, and it shouldn't be an issue. But if a fruit or a food has more fructose than glucose, then that extra fructose there is going to linger around in the gut and become food for pathogenic gut bacteria, and then cause fermentation, gas, etc. So it always has to be looked at through the lens of individual circumstances and needs. But there are some really interesting studies I mentioned in my book that showed that even diabetics eating several pieces of fruit per day didn't experience any change in hemoglobin A1C levels or insulin levels or weight. So I'm arguing that for most people, eating a normal amount of fruit, a few servings a day, is not going to be problematic at all.
And it's so interesting because anyone can run with that, right? There's a huge difference between saying excess fructose is harmful in some way, or saying fructose is harmful and poison and toxic. And that's the problem, because, if you're looking at eating an orange or an apple or something like that, and you're literally comparing apples to soda, then you're arriving at the answer that's just like, of course we can eat fruit. We've been eating fruit for a long time. It's no big deal. But this newfangled stuff, when you take certain pieces of that fruit and then juice it. So instead of eating an apple, you're like drinking 30 apples without any of the fiber. That's an entirely different thing. And it arrives at the same answer back to that evolutionary standpoint. It's just like, there's a little bit of common sense there. Right?
Absolutely,
there's a difference between eating an apple and chugging agave syrup.
Yeah. And I think that gets back, though, Abel, to where people get really confused. And in that confusion, they kind of, it's easy to get disconnected from that common sense and, put your faith in an authority. And if the authority is saying fructose bad, fructose toxic, I have a lot of patients who come to me, and everyone who comes to see me, I do a detailed case review. And part of that is them filling out a diet survey and giving me an average day in what they eat. And a lot of people are on a really low carb diets, and they don't even know that they're on low carb diets. They think they're low-ish, but they're eating probably less than 40 grams of carbohydrate a day. And I ask them why. And often the response is something like, because X person said fructose is bad, so I'm not eating fruit because I think it's going to give me diabetes or, take my liver down or something like that. And that's just kind of horrifying to me that I may have contributed to that in some way. And so I've been doing my best in my writing to clear that up. So that's one example. Another example is omega-6 fat and linoleic acid in particular. And this is somewhere where I certainly haven't completely reversed my view on this. I would say it's just become more nuanced and complex.
Yeah,
so
you're getting more refined with age.
More refined with age. That's a good way to put it. So yeah, the idea, of course, is that omega-6 fats like linoleic acid are pro-inflammatory, and we should avoid them for that reason. That's maybe one extreme. And then the other extreme of that argument, which is the mainstream view, is that omega-6 fats are beneficial because they lower cholesterol.
Mm-hmm.
And so we should replace all of our saturated fats with liquid vegetable oils, which is, of course, what was the dominant paradigm, has been the dominant paradigm for the past half century.
Yeah.
Again, I think that the reality is probably somewhere in the middle. There is some evidence that high intakes of linoleic acid even in natural foods like avocados and nuts and seeds and things like that can contribute to the formation of these compounds called oxalams, which are byproducts. They're a sign of oxidative damage occurring. Mm-hmm. And when oxalams have been associated with increased risk of heart disease, and studies have shown that decreasing our intake of linoleic acid can decrease the production of oxalams. But a lot of other studies that have looked at whether linoleic acid is pro-inflammatory have found no significant increases in pro-inflammatory compounds with high intakes of linoleic acid. Mm-hmm. So Christopher Ramsden, who works, I think, for the NIH and is a really active researcher in this field, has suggested that the adverse effects of linoleic acid might be tissue specific and go beyond inflammation. In other words, oxidative damage, it might not show up so much in pro-inflammatory markers. But one thing that can happen is that it inhibits the conversion of short-chain omega-3 fats into long-chain omega-3 fats like EPA and DHA, which are beneficial and can maybe interfere with some of the anti-inflammatory compounds that DHA and EPA produce. So it's a lot more complex when we're talking about linoleic acid in the form of natural foods. Mm-hmm. I still maintain that industrial seed oil is a poor choice for several reasons. So these are like corn oil, soybean, safflower, sunflower, cottonseed, all the liquid vegetable oils. Industrial seed oils are much more likely to become oxidized. They're used in processed and refined foods, which are cooked. And when you apply heat to those oils, as you know, they can oxidize and become damaged. And those damaged fats are problematic for the body. And they're often highly processed and refined, and they're extremely nutrient poor and calorie dense. So they have very few beneficial nutrients at all. And they just don't really, when you look at them from any perspective, other than the idea that they lower cholesterol, there's not really much of a reason to favor those oils. And this is, again, where we can apply that framework. We look back at the evolutionary template and we say, were these seed oils part of our ancestral diet? Mm-hmm. Answer is no. And then we look at the modern research. Do they have any beneficial effects other than lowering cholesterol, which is arguably beneficial?
Right.
No, they're not nutrient dense. They don't have, other than vitamin E, they have almost no measurable nutrients. So they don't play an important role. So in my opinion, if they're not benefiting us and they may be harming us and they're not part of the ancestral template, then
easy decision.
It shouldn't be a part. Yeah, easy decision. It shouldn't be a part of our diet.
Yeah.
Now, I do want to say here that, just make it clear that that's only the evaluation of whether they're part of our ancestral diet is only one part of that framework that I mentioned earlier. And I don't think that the lack of something in our ancestral diet is sufficient reason to avoid it today. Mm-hmm. And a really good example of that is dairy.
Yeah.
So maybe that's myth number 6.
Yeah, let's hit it.
One of the most prevalent myths, and this is another one, like the sodium myth that is is prevalent in both the well, actually, I would say this is more of a paleo myth, because if you look at mainstream dietary recommendations, you'll often see dairy on the food charts,
right.
As a healthy, beneficial food. So, the paleo idea goes that dairy has only been around for 10,000 years, and that's a tiny blip on the evolutionary timescale, and we're not really adapted to eat it. So, and our ancestors weren't eating it after weaning. So why, we shouldn't eat it. There are a couple of problems with that. Number one is that although our genes are largely the same as they were in the Paleolithic era, there have been some significant genetic changes since then. And in fact, some evolutionary biologists have suggested that evolution is occurring at 100 times faster rate than the average over the previous million years. Yeah, which is significant, right?
Yeah, totally.
And that as much as 10% of our genome has experienced changes in the past 10,000 years due to this increasingly rapid genetic selection that's occurring. And that's in part because of increased pressure to adapt and increases in population, both of which can speed up that process. So the dairy was a very interesting story because around the dawn of agriculture, 11,000, 10,000 years ago, we went from a much more nutrient-dense diet during the hunter-gatherer period to a much less nutrient-dense diet. And that was starting to show up in diseases of nutrient deficiency like rickets and skeletal deformities. We shrank by several inches as we made the transition from hunter-gathering to agriculture. And so if a new food source that was partly indigestible to humans occurred, and that food source had significant benefits from an evolutionary perspective. In the case of dairy, it contains certain nutrients that were hard to obtain elsewhere in an agricultural diet, like some vitamin D and vitamin A, fat-soluble vitamins. And it was a good source of hydration. So that, like during drought, you could drink milk and survive. And it has some other fatty acids that appear now, according to modern research, to have beneficial impacts on several different areas of physiology. So here was this food source that had a lot to offer, and we couldn't digest it partly. But there would be a tremendous pressure to adapt to that food source, right? That's just how it works. And sure enough, that's what happened. About 10,000 years ago, none of our ancestors could digest lactose, the sugar in milk, after weaning, which happened at about age 4 in our ancestors. And then a genetic mutation occurred somewhere around 8,000 or 9,000 years ago that led to the ability to continue to digest lactose into adulthood. And this is called lactase persistence. And it was a pretty crude genetic mutation. So essentially, we have a gene that turns off our ability to digest lactose after weaning. And this mutation just broke that gene so that it doesn't turn it off. So we're not talking about like this sophisticated, beautiful example, but actually in that short of a time frame, that's about all you can expect. You can't expect these complex multi-gene mutations. So lactase persistence then spread very rapidly, as you'd expect it to, because it conferred an advantage to anybody who possessed it. And now
ice cream is delicious.
Yeah, exactly. That wasn't the only advantage, but that's so now you have around the world a third of the population can now digest lactose into adulthood, and then in certain parts of northern where like there's a longer history of cattle herding, like in Scandinavia and Northern Europe, you have up to 97-98% of the population is lactose tolerant, and then in the cattle herding tribes, like in East Africa, you have 80-85% lactase persistence. So that's a huge change in 10,000 years. And that is a very relevant change in terms of our ability to better handle this agricultural food that wasn't part of the ancestral template, but nevertheless can be healthy when it's well tolerated by the individual.
Yeah.
And then you have not only genetic changes, you have cultural, or they would call them in research literature, technological changes. So by this, I mean human beings learned to ferment dairy products, and they didn't know the science behind this as we do now, but fermentation reduces or almost completely eliminates the presence of lactose in the dairy product. So if you are one of the 2 in 3 people worldwide that can't digest lactose, that doesn't mean that you can't eat or drink kefir, for example, that is almost completely free of lactose, or it doesn't mean that you can't eat butter, which, people figured out how to make by churning the milk, because it's virtually lactose free. So there are these innovations, human technological innovations, and then the last thing would be epigenetic or microbiome changes. So changes in gene expression, changes in our gut bacteria can affect our ability to tolerate and process certain foods. So an interesting example of this is coastal populations in Japan that are used to eating a lot of nori have a certain type of gut bacteria that can break down the polysaccharides in the nori that other people aren't able to break down.
Yeah.
They actually pass that bacteria down from generation to generation, so that if your family moves to this coastal part of Japan, eventually they would also possess the ability to break down those polysaccharides.
So crazy.
So it's pretty fascinating, and it just means that, yes, we should look to the ancestral template as a starting place, but we shouldn't consider it to be a destination, because there are other factors to consider.
Yeah. That's a great way of looking at it. We're almost out of time, but I'd love for you to quickly touch upon something that's, I think it illustrates your approach quite beautifully. And a lot of people in the paleo space are starting to go in that direction. And that's of not having to be 100% perfect all the time, not following dogmatically just these claims that are thrown out there by any dietary paradigm, but customizing your approach based upon your own food sensitivities, the way that your body responds, your training regimen, how much sleep you're getting, all this other stuff that's yours and you own it and only you can master that, right? And so an example of that is when you came to Austin and I was driving around my girlfriend's car that smelled of dog and all of that. And I was just like shuttling paleo people around the whole time. And one of the places that we took everyone was to like a grass-fed ice cream place. And I thought that was so cool. Delicious. And it was so delicious, yeah. But I think a lot of people, when they first hear about this paleo approach, they're just like, "Oh no, dairy is the worst thing in the world for you." But what you're starting to find is even like the leaders of this movement, after avoiding a lot of these foods for a few years, in most cases, you can kind of sub in these, you call them gray area type foods, right? Based upon your own experience. So can you just touch upon that briefly? Sure. Why is that important?
Sure. Yeah. So again, this came out of my own need and my own experience. When I first started with the paleo approach and I was following, I kind of discovered paleo on my own before I even knew it was paleo.
Me too.
I found out about Weston A. Price, and I started eating a lot of bone broth and slow cooked meats and organ meats and traditional fats. And they also recommend the properly prepared soaked grains and legumes.
Right.
And I tried that, but it really didn't work for me at all. So I removed those from my diet. And then I just intuitively removed dairy for a period of time just because I wanted to check out how it was for me. So lo and behold, I was on a paleo diet, right? But then I found that the sort of really strict paleo approach didn't really work for me. A lower carb strict paleo approach didn't work for me. I found that I needed more carbohydrates, and that I actually found that with experimentation with dairy that I thrive on at least fermented full fat dairy.
Yeah.
I don't drink milk, but I do really enjoy kefir and yogurt, which we make at home, and butter and ghee. And I find that I just feel great when I eat that. So, and then I was working, when I started to work with patients, I also found that just the one size fits all approach just was terrible with clinical practice, because everybody had different needs and different circumstances and lifestyles and goals. And, one patient might be 60 pounds overweight and sedentary and working in an office, and their goal is to lose weight. Am I going to put them on the same diet as someone who comes in who's training for the CrossFit Olympics and, is a lean male with a fast metabolism? Absolutely not, because they're really different circumstances there. So I developed this 3-step approach in my own life and then began to share it in my work with patients. So step 1 is like the strict paleo diet. And in fact, the way I like to refer to the strict paleo diet is essentially as an elimination diet.
Yeah.
That's where I think it functions best. You use it as a way of removing all of the foods that are most likely to cause problems. Doesn't mean that they absolutely do in everybody, but it means that those are the ones that are most likely to cause problems. Then in step 2, you start to add back the foods that I think are healthy when they're well tolerated by the individual. So those can include dairy products, as we've been discussing, white rice, which I think is better than brown rice because the anti-nutrients are in the hull or the bran of the rice and they've been removed. And then you just have starch, which is what remains. And I think humans are well adapted to starch for the most part. Then you have things like coffee and dark chocolate, both of which actually, according to the scientific literature, are beneficial because of their health, their antioxidant profile and other benefits, but can be...
Cheers to that.
Can be problematic. For example, coffee, if you have stage 3 adrenal fatigue, probably not such a good idea. So there are all these foods that are maybe yes, maybe no. I take people through this process of exactly how to reintroduce them and figure out whether they work for them. And then stage 3 is the refinement process. And that's where you look at things like macronutrient ratio. Do you do better with low carb or high carb? You look at meal frequency and timing. Do you do better with 3 square meals and snacks in between? Or do you do better with intermittent fasting, compressed food intake into like an 8-hour window? Customizing your diet for activity level. Again, if you're doing intense training, you're going to have different needs than someone who's barely exercising.
Right.
And we look at what I call paleo superfoods. So these are not the whiz bang superfoods that you buy in a box or at the store. These are things like bone broth and organ meats and fish eggs and cold water fatty fish and sea vegetables and natural whole foods that are extremely nutrient dense and have certain nutrients that are hard to get elsewhere in the diet. Totally. And so when you get to the end of that process, you will have the Abel James diet. And that's the diet that you should be following.
Yeah.
And all of your listeners will have their diet. And that's really the message that I'm trying to bring here, which is, don't even listen to what I say, except as far as it helps you to get to your own ideal approach.
Yeah. That's such a healthy way of looking at all of this. And I think it's one that it takes most people a little while to get over that threshold where they want to be told everything to do and what they can eat for dinner or whatever. But once you embrace that it is your own and you can find your own favorite foods within the template that works best for your health, that's when you can really start having some fun and really enjoy your life.
And I agree. It's threatening at first, but it's also empowering, as you said. When you're the final authority on what works for you and doesn't work for you, it's really quite a relief because you don't have to get caught up in all of these pointless internet debates about whether this food is good or bad. And the beauty of it is that for most people, if you're not dealing with a chronic illness that you're trying to treat and you're generally healthy and just want to optimize your health, there's some wiggle room. And that, hence the trip to the ice cream shop was awesome, by the way. And, I don't know if anyone got any pictures, but pretty much everyone was there.
Yeah.
And everyone was eating the ice cream. So
some of it was coconut ice cream, but pretty much everyone ate it. Yeah.
There's a lot more to life than food. Yeah. And just the pleasure and social contact and connection that comes from being able to go with everybody to that place and share in that experience is powerful medicine. And that's really often overlooked. And in fact, it can be more powerful. This is a great saying in Chinese medicine. It's better to eat the right food, the wrong food with the right attitude than the right food with the wrong attitude.
Yeah. So that's right. So if you eat ice cream, don't eat it from your fridge, from the tub in front of daytime TV or whatever after a rough day or nighttime TV, I guess. You go with a group of people who you really care about, and it's about the experience as opposed to how much you can shove down your gullet to make yourself feel better, because you won't.
Yeah, because the difference is, one, you're in the former case, you're probably completely distracted. You're using the ice cream to stuff some bad feelings that you don't want to experience, and you're just out to lunch the whole time you're doing it.
Yeah.
And in the latter case, you're probably quite present, you're connected with other people, you're feeling pleasure and joy. And I really believe, and I think the research on how pleasure and the experience of pleasure affects our body supports the idea that it can be transformative, and that the ultimate beneficial effects of that are outweigh any potentially harmful effect of eating ice cream, which is I think when it's done occasionally, there really isn't any harmful effect there.
Yeah, totally. Well, we're out of time, but before we go, why don't we talk about your book, Chris, and where folks can find you?
Yeah, so my book is called Your Personal Paleo Code, and the website is personalpaleocode.com, and you can find out more about the book there. There's some great free resources we're offering, and of course, all the links to order the book are there as well. And then my main website, where I blog several times a week, and you can find my podcast, Revolution Health Radio, where we talk about topics like this, is chriskresser.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. I encourage all of you who are listening right now, if you aren't familiar with Chris's work and you're more interested in a lot of the details of why this works and running down the rabbit holes and looking at the science, please check out Chris's work. It's definitely a place, your blog especially, that I pay attention to and keep up to date on, just because that's part of my own, I guess, one of the places that I get information, because I trust the work that you do. And that's one thing that I encourage all of you guys to do. Like, find those few sources. It doesn't have to be 60 of them, and usually it's not CNN.com, but find those few areas where you trust the information that's coming to you, and then have some fun and make your own diet. So thanks so much, Chris. I really appreciate you coming on, and I wish you the best of luck with this. I think you're going to do some damage with your book launch.
Thanks, Abel. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Chris. Hey, this is Abel, and I have a quick question for you. Do you want to get in the best shape of your life without giving up your favorite foods? Don't miss your opportunity to get the new Fat Burning Chef e-cookbook featuring more than 200 delicious recipes from the top paleo chefs in the world. You can get it now for a huge discount at fatburningchef.com. You can type it in from any device. Keep on listening for the details. Meet Jane. Jane knows she's supposed to eat right, but it's been one heck of a long day and she's short on time to cook a healthy, delicious dinner. Jane knows she can get lean by choking down reheated chicken breast and steamed broccoli 6 times a day for the next 3 months, but that doesn't sound like very much fun. Fortunately, Jane's in luck because her friend just sent her a collection of over 150 quick and easy recipes that just so happen to keep the pounds off. It's called the Fat Burning Chef. And through the magic of the interwebs, this handy, interactive digital cookbook beams straight to you instantly. And since it lives on your iPhone, iPad, Droid, computer, or other gizmo, you'll never be without quick and easy fat-burning meals. But it's not just about mouth-watering recipes. We want to change the world with real food. When you grab the Fat Burning Chef, you get another copy as a free gift to share with your friends and family. So if you're short on time and want to know what's for dinner tonight, head on over to fatburningchef.com and we'll fix you right up. Bon appetit, Jane. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Fat Burning Man. If you liked it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, the podcast app, or wherever else you might be listening to or watching this show. Got a second? Please leave me a quick review on iTunes. I always love hearing from you, and if you think someone else might like and benefit from this free show, please take a second to share it with a friend or with a family member. You can get in touch with me on Twitter at FatBurnMan and Facebook by typing in Abel James or Fat Burning Man. Drop me a line anytime. Did you know that I've recorded over 150 episodes of Fat Burning Man, winning 4 awards in independent media and hitting #1 in more than 8 countries? And here's some more good news. You can download and listen to every single episode for free. All you have to do is type in fatburningman.com. I'll give you a second to type it in, fatburningman.com. And you'll get all the show notes in video and audio versions for all the past episodes of Fat Burning Man. Better yet, enter your best email at fatburningman.com, sign up for my newsletter, and I'll even send you a quick start guide to start burning fat right now and a few of our ridiculously tasty recipes as a special thanks for signing up. Once again, just go to fatburningman.com right now, enter your best email to get your free fat burning download straight to your inbox, and make sure that you never miss a show again. This is Abel James signing off. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great week.
Thanks for having me here. It's a real pleasure, and it was such a pleasure to cheers with you over a virtual cup of tea.
Absolutely.
So the journal started because I'm a fan of positive psychology and behavioral change.